Me mateys, there be many a fearsome pirate out there in the seas of the Spanish Main and the seas around Madagascar, and there are even fearsome lady pirates. But you know what makes them fearsomer? If they are teenage girl pirates. You know what makes them the fearsomest? If they sail out there in the seas of space, and you can lay to that. Arr. Welcome back everybody to Pirate Winter, the series of videos where I talk about pirate books for as long as it takes for me to have a new tooth up there and not look like a pirate in a lot of ways. And today we'll be talking about Revenger by Alastair Reynolds from 2016, and we'll do all of the usual things. And before we go there, I will give a personal toast and cheers to one of my Patreon backers patrons. And if you want one of those, well, you know what to do. Join the channel or join the Patreon, and you all too will get a cheers. This one is for you, Ali. Thanks for helping out, and cheers. Alright, we'll be doing the usual thing. I'll give you a quick rundown of what the book is, and then we'll talk about details. And yes, we will be talking about Shadow Captain and Bone Silence next, but since these are 3 books that are all long enough and have enough stuff to talk about, I figured we might 3 videos. Also, you know, more space pirates, and that's good. So let's start and talk about what Revenger is. As I said, it is a 2016 science fiction novel by Alastair Reynolds, one of the more prolific hard sci-fi authors out there, at least for the 2000s, and someone whose books I generally love. Now, Revenger was certainly a bit of a change of pace for Alastair Reynolds because it is, well, more space opera. It does have a lot of like hard sci-fi stuff in there, but it's certainly mixed up with a lot of fantastic ideas and a less, you know, focused on technology kind of storyline. It is, as I said, a story about teenage girl space pirates, which is cool. So let's start what this is about. In a world that is called the 13th Occupation, there are ships between the stars, not between the stars, but in the solar system that use sails to capture solar winds and sail along those. And there are, well, people who travel between different places in the solar system to dig for, well, the remains of previous occupations or previous civilizations. And, of course, there are also pirates out there. We follow the story of 2 sisters, Adrana and Arthura, Fura, Ness, who, as teenagers, hire on to one of those sailing ships, and then stuff happens and they have some pretty big adventures. The story is told by Fura Ness in first person and talks about their first voyage in a lot of ways. There are quite a few twists in there, and I don't want to go about any of those, but it's a high-stakes, fast-paced adventure story about, well, 2 teenage girls in space having a lot of stuff happen to them. And if you thought this was YA because I said teenage girls, it's not really. It does certainly talk about, you know, coming of age and all of that, but it is pretty brutal in some parts, and I would not call it specifically YA because of that. It is, however, certainly something that younger readers who are, you know, into adventure stories will definitely enjoy, because it does use the adventure story as its format in a lot of ways. So yeah, if you enjoy space pirates, if you enjoy pirates, if you enjoy really unique sci-fi settings, this is something I can highly recommend. If you have never read any Alastair Reynolds, this is not going to give you the perfect introduction to Alastair Reynolds' work as a whole, but I certainly would recommend it to anyone. Even if other Alastair Reynolds was a bit too technical for you, this certainly might just be your thing, because it is very, very different in that regard. So yeah, highest recommendation for this one. I just reread it today and I absolutely love it. It's brilliant. Go read it. And now let's talk about why it is so brilliant, and why it fits into Pirate Winter 2025. So from here on out, there will be spoilers. So let's talk about several things. Let's situate it in pirate fiction as a whole, and then talk about how it does play with the genre of pirate fiction, where it takes it and where it doesn't take it, and you know, maybe mentions 1 or 2 plot elements in here. So let's recapitulate. When we talked about pirate fiction, in the past, we talked about how pirate history is already highly fictionalized, mythologized in a lot of ways, and how pirate media, like stories, books, novels, short stories, movies, operas, all of that have had a massive impact on how we see and what we think about pirates in a lot of ways. That's in fact, the through line, and we'll get back to that. So, one thing we also learned is that if you are writing a pirate story that is somewhat rooted in human history, that comes with a lot of problems or difficulties and challenges in that, you have to contend with historical facts that people kind of know. You also need to be respectful of all the dreadful things that were included in, piracy in, say, the 18th century, questions of racism, questions of, well, obviously sexism and so forth, but also questions of imperialism, colonialism. All of these things are tied into pirate history and have obviously, influenced how we think about pirates, what we use pirates to talk about, and all of that. And if you try to be, okay with that, and at the same time adhere to pirate fiction, which has often been produced in other ages, challenges arrive. So this is what we've spoken about before. We also talked about how changes in pirate fiction and in the language of film, for example, change how we write pirate stories, as, for example, with The Adventures of Amin al-Sirafi. So, what if, and this is the genius of Alastair Reynolds in this one, what if we actually take the things that make pirates cool and put them in a place that is not historical? Now, there are obviously several ways of doing that. One of them would be to write a fantasy story about fantasy pirates. The Life Ship Traders by Robin Hobb, for example, does feature pirates in a fantasy world and thus avoids a lot of the same questions or the challenges of incorporating history in a historical fiction, even if you add magic to it, say, like Tim Powers does in On Stranger Tides. And Alastair Reynolds goes the other direction and takes it to the stars. And we'll talk about why that is a really clever and good idea in a moment, but I think what I want to focus on first is that in order for this to work, you need to take the pirate story or the pirate myth and basically strip out and reduce it to its core, to the things that make pirates cool, that make pirates so incredibly memorable, and see if you can take those and just strip away all the history and the historical connotations that we also have with that. And that is what Alastair Reynolds did, I would argue, and then take the next step. Now, what kind of things do we associate with pirate stories? Well, we have ghost ships, of course, right? We have treasure that needs to be dug up somewhere. We have sailing ships, because pirates somehow are cooler when they are using sailing vessels, because the massive sailing vessels of like the 16th, 17th, 18th, and early 19th century are just really, really cool and impressive by their sheer complexity, mechanical complexity that is very difficult to overlook, right? So that is something that kind of makes pirate stories feel like pirate stories, right? A lot of these things. There are other parts of this. Obviously, pirates often being portrayed as rebels, or as incredibly bloodthirsty, or as both. And we've seen how, in a historical context, that can be a bit of a problem to square that specific issue between pirates being, on the one hand, evil, but also like the heroes we kind of root for. All of these are elements of a pirate story. Now, what you can do if you are writing fiction that is not historical is you can build your world around that to facilitate all of these things and bake it into the fundamentals of your world. That's something you could do if you would, for example, write a tabletop RPG about pirates, for example. Or, of course, if you do world building for a fantasy or science fiction novel. It's one of the most radical, according to China Miéville, strengths or things that fantasy after Tolkien did by having the power of world building. And sometimes this leads to, creating worlds that are highly aspirational and show us how cool things can be and how good things could be if we were, not living where we are living now. On the other hand, it does, of course, also allow us to purpose-build a world for the story that we want to tell. And with this specific one, that's what happened. Alastair Reynolds has written a lot of different sci-fi stories, built incredibly different universes, worlds, and so forth. This one is built for piracy. So let's talk about how that happened and how that reflects the world and then facilitates the kind of story that he's telling at this. All right? The first part that I spoke about is treasure and so forth. We get there. But for treasure to work and for piracy to work, what you need is economics. There have always been, economic elements in pirate stories in a way that other fantasy and often sci-fi stories don't necessarily feature the nitty-gritty of the economy. some, of course, do, but most don't. Pirates, however, need economy because you need to have merchants you can rob, but you also need people you can fence your stuff to. There's a lot of these kind of elements in a lot of piracy, and economic need is one of the things that does often lead to piracy. So you need to build some form of sort of global, or at least a somewhat large-scale economics, trade, and so forth into your world. And Alastair Reynolds does that. In the first novel, it doesn't really come up that much. There is, of course, mention of certain crashes in the financial market, and obviously we have pirates and people traveling around digging up treasure and selling it somewhere. So there is already the fact that a lot of this is about money, the same way that a lot of pirate stuff is about gold and gold coins, right? So the idea of having at least a monetary system is already baked in at the fundamentals. As I said, mostly this is hinted at here when we have mention of 2 big banking crashes. Now, an interesting thing here is that one of the first banking crashes, like large speculation crashes in human history, or in recent modern history, was the bursting of the South Sea bubble. You can look that up. George MacDonald Fraser even made a dumb joke about it in The Pirates, and having sort of like the big crash that changed a lot of things as one of the backdrops that sort of is mentioned a couple of times in these in the book. Works both on a historical level, but also creates that understanding that there is a sort of pressure to find all of these things, and there is a certain level of volatility possibly connected to pirate action. So that's the first part that I think is interesting. Now the next part is, of course, treasure. We all know pirates want treasure, and we all know that pirates don't necessarily just need to, rob other ships, but also to dig up treasure. Now this world is built that way. It is a far, far, far future world, like 10 million years in the future. We have all these baubles, all these asteroids, habitats, and so forth, floating around the sun, and full of, stuff from previous cultures that you can dig up. Some of it possibly being cursed. Ghosty stuff, right? So we have that built fundamentally into the setting. People can be good treasure hunters, like, say, people looking for pirate treasure, but they can also be pirates and dig up treasure, or, pounce upon the people that are digging up the treasure, right? So it is fundamentally baked into the story, and it is one of the pillars of pirate stuff. Now the next one is, of course, as I said, ghost ships and so forth. And the legend of Bosa Sennen, who has a ship that is hard to find, the Nightjammer being hard to find or almost invisible, being around forever. People whisper about her existence, whisper about it, and maybe believe she's not real. That's the perfect sort of like setting part built in there. And because this is science fiction, there's of course a story explanation of how this could happen and still also be, real at the end of the day. So that's another one. Then there is, of course, exploration. Pirate stories are always about exploration, and that ties into the story of the treasure thing, but it also goes into a different direction. See, the age of piracy, in particular the age of the golden age of piracy, is an age where, it's at the beginning of what you might call the Enlightenment in a lot of ways. So you have scientific paradigms slowly taking over, but there's still enough sort of gray spaces where stuff happens that people don't understand. And the people that do understand things are, of course, experts and very specific, specialists that have very specific, almost secret knowledge in a lot of ways. Navigation is a skill that very few people had in the 17th century or the 16th century, and the world that Alastair Reynolds set up allows that. So exploration is about mapping the known universe, finding things in there, and sort of pushing the boundaries of understanding the world and finding places. And this setting is once again built up for that, because while it has a deep, deep history in like 10 million years, previous occupations, all of that stuff, the current occupation is only just figuring these things out. There's a lot of stuff people don't know, and there's a lot of stuff where people maybe know how it works, but not why it works. And that is something you can do in deep history, in science fiction, without, calling some people ignorant or so forth, and have sort of like the technological differences that can be part of what makes a pirate story work in sci-fi as well, which is, really, really clever. So that's just like some of the reasons why building a science fiction setting around this works so well. And we'll come back to that in both Shadow Captain and Bone Silence, because there's obviously more elements to this. And then there's just like the thing that you can do something really cool in in science fiction or fantasy that you can't do in history, and that is come up with like just plain crazy awesome stuff. Which brings us to the skulls. So the idea that there are alien skulls that still communicate on a technological level that humans don't understand, and that there are some people who can operate them and send their own thoughts from skull to skull, is just, plain awesome, because it takes the idea of having communication between ships in a way that you can't necessarily do in space, the way that you could do that, say, with flags and signals and smoke and stuff like that in a sailing vessel. Makes it a bit more complex and almost like radio communication, but it still makes it spooky and weird and gothic in a lot of ways. And pirates can be slightly gothic in that regard, that it's often overly elaborate things happening. So that's another part, which then brings us, of course, to the next part, and that is pirate stories do, of course, impact other pirate stories. And there's something really clever that Alastair Reynolds does with this, because while this is a space story, it also has some very direct references or hints and nods and homages to other pirate stories, and then does something interesting and subverts them in a lot of ways. So let's talk about that. See, two pirate books we spoke about here previously on Pirate Winter was, of course, Treasure Island and On Stranger Tides. And both do sort of, get subverted in Revenger in some interesting ways. Let's start with the first part. Treasure Island. See, Treasure Island starts, it's a story of Jim, who learns about treasure, goes out, encounters fearsome pirates that he didn't think he would encounter, and then comes back home. There is someone dying of a heart attack or a stroke in the beginning, that being obviously Billy Bones and so forth. There's also the fact that one parent has already died and so forth, right? It's in Jim's case, it's obviously his father passing away, something that happens here as well, but, so we have that. Now, the Ness sisters have lost their mother before, and their parent, their father is obviously in financial straits and so forth, and they decide to help everyone out by finding treasure, which is how the story starts. So there are parallels, but we have two girls instead of one boy. The heart attack thing, I think, is probably not on purpose, but you can see these resonances, and that's something that we learn when we read more and more books, how more and more things resonate and we can connect them. So that's just like something, the basic story of a young person going out into space or going out into sea to find treasure and save their family business. It's obviously a plot that we have seen before, but it's a very clear pirate-y story that we can see in Treasure Island, for example. And it's, as I said, subverted, and we'll talk about how it is subverted beyond, having two girls instead of like one boy. There's more subversion going on there. Now, another thing that I think is interesting here is, of course, On Stranger Tides. See, one plotline in On Stranger Tides is, of course, the story of Elizabeth Herwood and her father, Professor Herwood, whose name I keep forgetting for whatever reason, but, Professor Herwood. And we know that a large part of that plotline is about Professor Herwood losing his wife and all the things being sort of triggered around that. Now, it turns out that the Ness sister, the father Ness, also has lost his wife and is taking actions that are bad towards his daughters because of that grief about the loss of his wife. So we have that parallel here, but now is where something really clever and interesting happens, because he doesn't get away with it. Whereas in On Stranger Tides, Elizabeth Herwood constantly needs other people to rescue her, is drugged, and a very, very passive character throughout the entire story. This one here, not so much. The Ness sisters take action. They go out, and once it's Fira alone back home, she does, once again, the thing. She escapes from the clutches of her father, who is literally drugging her the same way that Herwood was drugging Elizabeth in On Stranger Tides. But she overcomes that and takes action and regains agency and goes out there and does all of these things. Once again, this may not be on purpose, but I think it's interesting to see how you take something that was maybe a bit of a problem or a not very well executed storyline in On Stranger Tides, and by few adjustments turns it into something fundamental to this story that also works really well in this one as a subversion of an older part of the pirate corpus in a lot of ways. So that's just like a really clever and interesting thing. Now let's move forward. Now, obviously, the story itself goes out. We have the pirate encounter. We have the big plot twist when Adrana is kidnapped and Fura swears to fight back. We have the building of a crew. We have the taking over of a crew. We have a lot of like weird morals. People are constantly lying. No one here is a clear-cut good character, which is once again something that we have a lot of in pirate stories, right? We have all of these grey characters, anti-heroes, all of that. Something that obviously Captain Blood Colonel Blood in the Pirates was very much a bit of a send-off of. Here, it's just about everyone, because life on shipboard is often kind of dreary, right? And critical, and there's a lot of stuff going into that. Which brings me to why I think this works so well in this specific story. See, I said it is a bit of a coming-of-age story, right? And it is, in a lot of ways. But the point about growing up is that it is often about finding out who you are, who you want to be, figuring out what that does with you, and maybe finding a purpose in life. This is something that works really well versus, say, Treasure Island. Treasure Island is not about that. Treasure Island is about finding the treasure, coming back home, and settling back home. Everything is restored to pre-story levels at the end of Treasure Island. Jim is, well, he's rich, but he lives back in merry old England, and so forth. This is not this kind of story. Obviously, it's a setup for a trilogy, but this is very much that at the end of the story, the Ness sisters, at least Fura, has decided that, you know, being a space pirate is maybe exactly what she wants to be, because there is more to find out. There is a larger world out there. Exploration has just begun. There may be wrongs to right. And we have that twist with Bosa Sen, where we know that she's cruel and evil and so forth. But then we find out that maybe she is actually doing the right thing, just using the wrong methods, I guess. But we have that, an attempt of twisting that idea of being the rebels against evil imperialism on the one hand, but also being, well, bloodthirsty pirates on the other hand, transported into space and turned into something interesting here, and allowed our heroes, or heroines in this case, to, well, switch sides and become pirates, and still be sort of, kind of the good guys, or girls in this case. And I think why this works so well in this specific book is that, yes, you don't have the historic baggage with it that comes with that when you write a historical pirate fiction, and on the other hand, they are very unapologetic. Fura is very unapologetic about it. It is about necessity, rising above that necessity and making it your own, because that's an important thing. A lot of times you have people do terrible things and justify, well, I had no other choice. And that is often the case. But that takes away something of moral agency from characters. We don't have that here. Fura decides to do these things, and she may be pressured and all of that, but afterwards she goes, well, actually, I wouldn't change things. This is the best way things could have come out. And that, I think, is really helpful, because it is very empowering, which I think is part of what makes this story work so well versus some of the pirate stories that we've spoken about before, where the level of empowerment kind of flags behind. Even in something like as assertive and sassy as The Adventures of Amina al-Sirafi, that also is mostly done out of the need to save people and so forth. And yes, there is an admission that she enjoys what she's doing, but yeah, it's not like, yeah, well, there's a doubt there that is not exactly here in this specific book, and I think it's helpful, because this is, well, not a YA story, but it's still a story that a lot of people growing up would probably enjoy, and realizing that you will make mistakes, you will make problematic, troubling choices. Sometimes you don't have a choice and you have to do something bad while growing up and becoming the person that you really want to be. You need to own that. You need to be the person that you want to be, and look forward and find a purpose that will give meaning to what you have done before. Finding that meaning and creating that meaning, I think, is at the core of this specific story. And that's a good thing. That's a really, really good thing. Now, with all of that out of the way, I think we'll leave it at that for this one. We'll talk about Shadow Captain very soon, because, you know, I won't have that smile forever. And if you have read Revenger, please let me know what you thought about it. Did you enjoy it? If so, why? Did you not enjoy it? If so, why? Let me know in the comments. Do all those wonderful things. Share, like, subscribe, comment, join the Patreon if you want a personal cheers, join the channel if you want a personal cheers, do all of those wonderful things, or, you know, just read a cool pirate book. And yeah, with that, thanks and cheers.